It's a very beautiful day outside. As a Eurocentric institution, the Frick Collection rarely has occasion to invite experts in American art and history to lecture. Of course, our original house and its extension were built by distinguished American architects, Thomas Hastings and John Russell Pope, in addition to the work of expatriate painter James McNeill Whistler. We have one great American painting in Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington. In fact, tonight's speaker is present indirectly because of a connection between Washington and Thomas Jefferson. We are preparing an exhibition on Canova's George Washington, a lost masterpiece that was the famed Italian sculptor's only work for the United States. The exhibition, opening May 22nd, brings together the original plaster version of the lost marble with preparatory drawings and terracottas from the museum in Canova's hometown of Posagno. The statue was commissioned by the North Carolina legislature on the advice of Thomas Jefferson. It arrived in 1821 and within a decade was destroyed in a fire which consumed the state capitol in Raleigh. Our chief curator, Xavier Salomon, spent a number of weeks in Monticello last summer reading and researching the considerable correspondence between Jefferson and others about the sculpture, which we are bringing together in a kind of recreation here in this exhibition, which, after this roundabout story, returns us to tonight's speaker, who, as vice president of Monticello, was helpful to our forthcoming exhibition. Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy is also the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies and Professor of History at the University of Virginia. After receiving his doctorate from Oxford University, he eventually moved to this country and was professor as well as chair of the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh from 1998 to 2003, before transferring to the University of Virginia. He is a prolific lecturer and author, notably of An Empire Divided, The American Revolution and the British Caribbean, published in 2000. His most recent book, The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire, published in 2013, received no less than 8 national awards. His subject tonight, The Old Gamester, General John Burgoyne, stems from this recent area of his research. His lecture focuses on the subject of the Frick's painting by Joshua Reynolds, General John Burgoyne, of about 1766, who surrendered some 10 years later to American troops at Saratoga in 1777. Please join me in welcoming Professor O'Shaughnessy.
Well, thank you, and thank you to Ian and also Xavier Salmon, who invited me, and Persephone Allen, who's done a lot of the logistical work. Now, the talk is based on 10 personalities that I describe in a book called The Men Who Lost America. These are the 10 key decision makers, both political and military. I usually give general talks about the book rather than the specific individuals, so I do want to just do what I do when I'm introducing the book in general, and that is to show you the American and the British cover, because they are different. This is the American cover, done by Yale University Press. I have to say that it has color illustrations, which I think is important for those of us who appreciate art, and although I can make few claims for the contents, there's no book with more red-colored illustrations on the American Revolution anywhere else available. This is actually a painting by the American artist John Singleton Copley, who of course went over to England at the beginning of the American Revolution and spent the rest of his career there. And it actually is a painting from the American Revolution, but not from America. It's a painting, in fact, done in Gibraltar, and it's a painting of one of the few British victories of the war. And it should remind us that artists will often be portraying victories rather than defeat. I didn't want to use the usual John Trumbull paintings, but there are really no British paintings in many of the major episodes of the American Revolution. This, though, was important because it was a reminder that the war was not simply fought in America. It's also, the original painting is almost life-size. It looks like a mural, and very few people would know it, because for 40 years, from the Second World War, it was kept in Gibraltar for safekeeping. And it's not in one of the major British art galleries. It's in the Guildhall Art Gallery, which I would certainly recommend. It was the art gallery of the City of London, which was very wealthy, and the main financial district. And so they are a remarkable collection of paintings. But in the Yale edition, they just have a detail from the painting. And it's really very appropriate. It shows two British commanders. And when I have friends look at it, they say firstly that the superior officer looks as though he's waving into the distance. And he looks very aloof, a kind of role that could be played by Sir Laurence Olivier. And then the junior commander looks as though he's looking up to him and saying, "What are you thinking?" And in some ways, that captures the essence of what I'm writing against rather than what I'm suggesting. I'm actually writing against the idea that this war was lost by bad leadership. The title was the title that I wanted alone. I simply wanted to call it The Men Who Lost America, but publishers on both sides of the Atlantic said this would confuse people, and I quickly realized people's political backgrounds when they either claimed that it was about the Obama administration or about the Bush administration, depending on their political proclivities. Then the subtitle, I want you to remember, because the British subtitle is different, although I assure you the outcome in both books is the same. But it's British Leadership in the American Revolution and the Fate of the Empire. And then even my name is different in the British edition. In this Yale edition, they have my full name, Andrew Jackson O'Shaughnessy. They liked that because it sounded like the American president. I have to admit that Jackson was my mother's maiden name. On the other hand, my father and both my parents I would describe as Americophiles. There's no such word, but they were very fond of America. My father had just read the Schlesinger biography of Andrew Jackson, which of course says nothing about Indian removal or any other unpleasant aspects of Jackson's life, and really just portrays him as a very positive proponent of democracy and a very blunt proponent of democracy. And in fact, my parents lived here for many years, so I came to the Frick as a child. My father taught at Columbia University, and I'm very glad to have a number in the audience that I knew from that time. This is the British cover of the book. As you see, it's a slightly different angle of the painting. Instead of just seeing the two commanders, you've got this rugby scrum of victorious-looking redcoats, because British publishers really weren't interested in the American Revolution, and they said that the British reading public are not interested in it. They say that the British do not like to read about their defeats, only their successes, which I suppose is true of most nationalities. They cut out my middle name, saying it sounded too American. It's perhaps one of those little-known transatlantic differences that middle initials, middle names, are less commonly used in Britain than in America. If you remember, Harry Truman had to create a middle initial because it was so expected in this country. And then if you look at the subtitle, it's a little different. In America, it's British leadership. In Britain, it's British command. those words convey a slightly different tone. And even the rest of the title, instead of the fate of the empire, it's the preservation of the empire. And I must admit, I slightly mischievously called the last section of this book Victory, because in fact this was a war in which the British defeated the French almost as soundly as they would later defeat them at the Battle of Trafalgar, which we'll see in a moment. So the book really deals with the question, why did Britain lose America? It was a war that seemingly Britain shouldn't have lost, because they just won the so-called French and Indian War in this country, or the 7 Years' War as it's known in Europe, in which not only Britain gained Canada, but it also gained Bengal in India, and indeed Cuba and Martinique and Guadeloupe, which they later gave back in the peace process. But it was a huge victory against not only the French, but also the Spanish as well. And then after the American Revolution, the British went on to win the French Revolutionary Wars, and they defeated Napoleon, who's often regarded as the greatest general in history. And many of those involved in the defeat had been involved in the American Revolution. And they included many officers who'd served under Burgoyne. So the question is, what went wrong? And I would suggest that one of the most popular responses to that, especially among lay people, is that it was a failure of leadership, that the British were essentially led by aristocratic buffoons, and the patriots were led by people who were self-made and had risen by meritocratic means, neither of which is true on either side. We should always remember that George Washington was possibly the wealthiest man in America, and I'd forgotten you have a portrait here, of course, of Washington, a very interesting early portrait of him. And in fact, Washington was appalled that he felt there were too many officers getting into the ranks of the Continental Army who were not from genteel backgrounds, and most of them were. So the idea is that the British lost by these aristocratic buffoons, and you find this most of all in movies. So we'll see, I'm going to show you a clip in a moment from a movie portraying a senior British officer that I will argue is really very much modeled with Burgoyne in mind. You get it in popular literature. The most popular historian in America in the 1970s was Barbara Tuchman, and she wrote a book called The March of Folly. And in fact, this book was really about Vietnam, and she was really arguing that the war had been folly, but she wanted to illustrate this with other wars, and a third of the book is devoted to the British in America and to this series of caricatures of British officers. And finally, even in academic books, you find the word hidebound used a great deal, and also incompetent. These terms creep up a great deal. And indeed, in American college textbooks and in serious monographs, General John Burgoyne is often called Gentleman Johnny. And that seems to be getting at the idea that he was obsessed with his sartorial elegance. It was indeed a nickname that his soldiers gave him, but we're going to see a bit later that, in fact, that was not why they gave him that nickname. Indeed, I want to suggest that Burgoyne was really regarded as the archetype of a British officer by people who write about the American Revolution. They're very influenced by his personality. and that they see him as essentially frivolous. And there is some reason to see him that way. He was extremely pretentious. He was very much a rake in his lifestyle in London. He hung out with what were known as the ton, which were basically the jeunesse dorée, the fast set in London, who surrounded the Duchess of Devonshire, about whom Amanda Foreman, who's here in New York, wrote a great biography, and it then became a movie called Duchess. He was known by the nickname General Swagger, or Julius Caesar Begonius. He was a gambler, and in fact, the title of this lecture, The Old Gamester, comes from the general who opposed him, Horatio Gates, who was in fact British and a former British officer, and really had Burgoyne's measure. There was a very rash streak to his personality, which did indeed play a role in his defeat, but was not the main reason for his defeat. It also happens that he was a playwright and wrote a number of successful plays, and I'm going to talk about a few of those in a moment. He loved to be surrounded by artists of different types. He was a great friend of the actor David Garrick and staged a number of plays with David Garrick. He was very friendly with the architect Robert Adam, with Alan Ramsay, the portrait painter, and with Richard Brinsley Sheridan, with whom he would write a play after the American Revolution. Indeed, one memoirist who was writing about Burgoyne after the American Revolution said that his appearance seemed more fitted to a drawing room than a military camp. It didn't help that he was very pretentious in his speech-making. And finally, he was involved in a battle that was really the turning point of the American Revolution, the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 in upstate New York. And that battle would really be the green light for the French coming into the American Revolution, followed by the Spanish, followed by the Dutch, and followed by much of the rest of Europe, signing something called the League of Armed Neutrality. So after Saratoga, Britain would be more isolated than in almost any other battle of its history. The parallel that's often given is 1940, when the British essentially stood alone against Nazi Germany. So I'm going to show you this brief film clip. I couldn't find a film clip depicting Burgoyne other than in documentary specifically. But the clip that I'm going to show you is in fact common for all the movies. This happens to be from The Patriot, which you're going to tell me is a kind of low bowl, because of course Mel Gibson isn't known for his pro-British films. He did a number of others besides The Patriot. But I'm also thinking of movies like Revolution with Al Pacino. And it goes a long way back. In fact, during the First World War, there was a movie made about the American Revolution, and the director of it was actually put in prison because the First World War was a period of intense pro-British feeling in America, and he was unfortunate enough that his movie came out during just the opening of the war, and the case went before the Supreme Court, and it was called The Government of the United States versus the Spirit of 1776, which is the name of the movie. Now, in this clip, it's really meant to be Cornwallis, but it's nothing like Cornwallis. Cornwallis was the most aristocratic of the generals, but the most down-to-earth, much more down-to-earth than Burgoyne. This was a general who, at Rams's Mill in North Carolina, threw away all of his tents and his provisions and his rum and slept out in the open with his men his commander-in-chief, Sir Henry Clinton in New York, said it was like a Tatar army, meaning that it was basically barbaric. In this clip, Burgoyne is shown to be more concerned about his clothing than about getting military reinforcements and artillery off the ships nearby. His clothing, incidentally, is immaculate. He's wearing this wonderful scarlet uniform that he calls a horse blanket. He's also shown as being more worried about his dogs. Well, Cornwallis, as far as I know, never had dogs, although William Howe in New York. So it's really a composite British general. And after that, I want to talk about why these caricatures, and they really are caricatures of these people, are in fact caricatures, and that beneath the veneer were very serious soldiers. And I also want to explain that by being misled by these caricatures, it really deflects us from understanding why the British were defeated. That there's a very serious side to this, that if we just focus on the personalities, we really lose the larger picture of why they lost the Revolutionary War.
Finished, my lord. I've taken it in at the back, added wider epaulets and looped gold braiding. It's a horse blanket.
Oh, I don't know, my lord. It's really quite nice.
Very nice, my lord.
Very well, it's a nice horse blanket. Colonel Tavington, why, after 6 weeks, am I still here in Middleton Place attending a ball in South Carolina when I should be attending balls in North Carolina? First, the theft of my personal baggage, including my memoirs, upon which I spent countless hours. Then half the bridges and ferries between here and Charlestown burned. Colonel, if you can't protect our supply lines against militia, how do you intend doing so against the colonial regulars or the French when they arrive?
My lord, they won't fight like regulars. We can't find them.
Colonel, they're militia. They're farmers with pitchforks.
They're rather more than that, I'm afraid, my lord. Made so by their commander, this ghost.
Oh, ghost, ghost, ghost. You created this ghost, Colonel.
My lord.
Your brutality has swelled his ranks, without which this ghost would have disappeared, and I would be in North Carolina or Virginia by now.
In my defense, my lord.
Oh, enough, enough. Fine soldier, you are bested by a bedtime story. Give me the horse blanket. My lord. General O'Hara, our supply ship appears to have arrived.
Yes, my lord, it has. Yes.
Then why am I still wearing this rag?
My lord, your replacement wardrobe is aboard ship, but Colonel Tavington thought it best to secure our arms and munitions first. They are being unloaded now.
You look good in that color.
Stinks.
It's had a dead man in it.
The beast took your dogs as well.
Yes, yeah. Fine animals, a gift from His Majesty. Dead now, for all I know.
Is there no decency?
Oh, fireworks! Lovely!
So in fact, the portrait here at the Frick is an excellent starting point for demonstrating the seriousness of Burgoyne as a soldier. It is, incidentally, the best portrait of him, and I think one of Reynolds's outstanding portraits. The other really great Reynolds portrait from the American Revolution is of Bannister Tarleton, arguably one of the most hated British officers in America. And in fact, Tarleton is the cavalry officer in the Patriot. For some reason, they don't call him Tarleton. But that's a magnificent painting in the National Gallery, again, almost life-size. But this portrait actually shows Burgoyne at the height of his career. It was not commissioned by him, and this is what is significant. And I'm afraid historians are often rather Philistine. We're more often interested in the context and what's the stories that surround the pictures rather than the pictures themselves, although the picture tells us a lot as well. But the man who commissioned this picture was called Wilhelm Laliep, Count of Schomberg-Lippe, and was a German adventurer and one of the great military leaders of the 18th century, a particularly great artillery officer. And Lippe commissioned this picture in admiration of Burgoyne. And the reason he admired Burgoyne is that Burgoyne had commanded under him during the 7 Years' War in Europe, the French-Indian War here, in which Britain was not only at war with France, but also Spain. And Burgoyne led the defense of Portugal. And Portugal, to this day, is Britain's oldest ally. And Burgoyne essentially won a great victory that was at Valencia de Alcantara, in which basically he prevented a Spanish invasion of Portugal. One of the great terrors of Portuguese history was ever being annexed, as it had been under Philip II, to Spain. The King of Portugal was so grateful, he gave Burgoyne an incredible ruby set in gold. And he is, to this day, a military hero in Portugal. And one thing that has struck me is how context is all important. And a lot of the people that I dealt with in my book were very successful in other contexts. And those who are younger than Burgoyne and went on to command in later wars would actually become leading British war heroes. The portrait, it seems that the first sittings were booked in 1764, but Burgoyne cancelled 5 of them. And then he seems to have sat twice in May of 1766. A fee of 70 guineas is recorded in Joshua Reynolds' accounts. And this painting did not stay with Burgoyne or with any of his family. This painting was kept by Count Laliep in his family and descended through that family into the early 20th century. And what I understand is that it was purchased by J.P. Morgan, who later sold it to the Frick collection. But that is significant. That is how much one of the greatest military commanders of the age regarded Burgoyne. Not only did he, as it were, commission the painting, but he also wrote a panegyric about Burgoyne, which appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine. That was the leading quarterly, the leading journal, read by the landed gentry in England. And the point is, at this point of Burgoyne's career, he seemed actually one of the most successful rising stars in the British Army. He'd entered the army aged 15, and that was very common among these officers of going into the army young. He was not part of an aristocratic family. He was the least aristocratic of all of those who commanded in America. He was part of a cadet branch of a gentry family in Bedfordshire who had a baronetcy, which is a very low-level title, but it basically is like a hereditary knighthood. His cousin was called Sir John Burgoyne. However, there were lots of doubts at the time about his legitimacy, and that it was claimed by the wife of someone called Lord Bingley that Lord Bingley was his father. And that seems to be given some credibility because Lord Bingley, when he died, left a huge amount of money to John Burgoyne's mother, and he'd stated that he intended John Burgoyne to be his heir if he hadn't had any other children by that time. And Burgoyne never had very much money. He was always short of money, and most of his rise in the army were through contacts that he successfully made. Partly with Bingley's money, he went to a major school, the best school in England at the time, Westminster School in central London. And at Westminster School, he was in the class with the heir to the Earl of Derby. And in fact, the Earl of Derby later went on to create the horse races, the Derby, and I suppose the Kentucky Derby is a derivative of that, and also the Oaks in England. But the Derbys became really his patrons. He twice had to sell his army commission, and this was going to be an issue in his later life because he lost seniority. He twice left the army. One time was because he eloped with his friend's sister, who was only 15, and the Derby family weren't very pleased with him, and he married the daughter, and they went off to France and hid in France for a while and visited Rome, and then finally he was accepted back into the Derby family. He was from a family with a military tradition. This is a portrait of him by Alan Ramsay, who was a friend, and Burgoyne essentially did the Grand Tour. And this is quite interesting because it shows Burgoyne in front of the Colosseum, and I think it's always interesting to ask the extent to which a sitter influences the artist. And in this case, and in the case of the Joshua Reynolds portrait, there's always a certain melodramatic quality to his stance and appearance, especially the Reynolds painting. It's interesting in this painting, which is done in 1755, that he's wearing a military coat, because he was actually out of the army at this time, but it may have signified his intention to return to the military, and that certainly seems to have been his ambition. Now, I'm now going to show you a portrait which none of you have seen because it's only been identified in the last year by an art historian and dealer called Christopher Bryant. But again, it's very telling about Burgoyne's seriousness as a soldier. In fact, Bryant had owned this painting twice and had never realized the subject of it previously. But Bryant is the leading authority on British military portraiture of the 18th century. And what he does is to look very closely at the uniforms and the buttons and the epaulets. And this is a particularly unusual uniform because Burgoyne in the 1750s created his own regiment. That was a huge honor. Very few people were asked to start their own regiment because it was a very profitable thing to do, but it was so profitable that it was an honor given very sparingly. And he was invited to found his own cavalry regiment, and he founded the 16th Light Dragoons. They were sometimes called the Burgoyne Light Dragoons or the Queen's Light Dragoons. And this is a painting of him as colonel of that regiment, and we can look at the physiognomy of the face. It seems to have possibly been done in Italy because of the weave of the canvas. But his recruiting of this regiment really shows a great deal of his entrepreneurialism and his ability as an officer. He put up posters in Northamptonshire, and people generally didn't advertise and put up posters. And he appealed to people's vanity. He said, women are much more attracted to men in cavalry regiments than any other regiment. But what is even more interesting is not just how he recruited the people in his regiment, but how he conducted the regiment. He insisted that every cavalry officer learn to work in a stable and how to bridle horses and to do the basic work, mucking out a horse, that any of the men in the cavalry would be expected to do. He also encouraged a sort of egalitarianism among the officers to speak freely even with the soldiers. And this is why he became known as Gentleman Johnny, because he was always concerned about the conditions of ordinary men, which was really unknown at this time in the British Army. He was concerned about pay, and he was concerned about the way that they be treated. And he would make a case for improving those. He also insisted that his officers study and that they learn to read French, because the best military manuals were in French. He himself spoke fluent French and was familiar with a lot of the French commanders, having lived in France. He insisted that there be no swearing, and he had a formal code of conduct for the regiment. After the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, he went on a tour of Europe to analyze the leading armies of Europe in 1765, and he wrote a report, and it's a very remarkable reading, and quite a remarkable undertaking as well. He visited the armies of France, of Prussia, and Austria. These were the leading armies in the world at that time. They were much larger than the British Army individually. It was actually very difficult for him to see some of these troops firsthand. So in order to see some of the military of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he actually went into disguise in what's now the Czech Republic. And he produced this report in which he looked at the strengths and weaknesses of each military and what the British could learn. But what was remarkable about the report from a sociological perspective is he said you can't simply import these characteristics easily. And this is often an error made in international business in trying to copy the conduct of another country and the methods divorced from the social context. He argued, for example, that the British soldier would never be willing to endure the discipline of the Prussian army. He said Prussians treat their soldiers like slaves. You have to treat the British soldier as an individual. And he made other such comments. Now, after he got back from this tour and he circulated his foundings, he became essentially the toast of London. And on the eve of the American Revolution, in the summer of 1774, Burgoyne was really, his reputation was at its height. He was now fully accepted by the Derby family. He wrote one of his first plays, which is called The Maid of Oaks, that he wrote for the marriage of his brother-in-law, and he put on a grand fete at the Oaks, which was one of his brother-in-law's houses, and the fete included a play. It reminds me a little of the sort of 17th century masks designed by Inigo Jones, and for example, Robert Adam designed the set. Adam, the architect, decided the sets. It was obviously a rather wild occasion. There were shepherdesses on swings, nymphs descending from clouds, musicians in bushes. But the play itself is quite interesting and went on to be performed in London. For example, the leading heroine in the play makes a speech in favor of women's rights and a more equal treatment of women, which again, I think, captures some of the seriousness of Burgoyne. Similarly, in the summer of 1774, Burgoyne was in Parliament. and really establishing himself as a political figure. And this was very common among British officers, especially those that aspired to senior command. They were also members of Parliament, and that went on, incidentally, almost up to the Second World War. And Burgoyne in Parliament distinguished himself leading the opposition to the East India Company, which was one of the largest companies at the time. It was really an international company. Today we'd think of it as a multinational company, but it was a company that had its own army and its own navy, and that governed British India. And by the eve of the American Revolution, this company was going bankrupt, and as we would have said in 2008, it was too big to fail. Burgoyne was particularly critical of the corruption within the company, and he very courageously led an investigation, an inquiry into Lord Clive of India. He was the officer who'd been successful at the Battle of Plassey, who'd essentially delivered Bengal to the British, had become incredibly enriched by his time in India. And in many ways, this inquiry mirrored a later inquiry by Edmund Burke into Warren Hastings, and it helped to establish new codes for the way that British officers and officials could behave towards native peoples. Clive of India actually committed suicide during the inquiry, which gives you some idea of how effective Burgoyne was. Later, Lord North would pass the East India Tea Act to make it cheaper to import tea into America, which started the Boston Tea Party. So the two things were related. But Burgoyne also started to speak about America, and his speeches were very hostile to the growing patriot movement, which was unusual because all of the other British commanders in America, all in fact seemed to be very sympathetic to the American cause before the American Revolution. Cornwallis was one of only 6 members of the House of Lords to vote against the Stamp Act. And so Burgoyne called the Americans spoilt children. He argued for a more authoritarian policy, although he didn't seem keen to go on what he called that service, because as like a lot of British officers, there was not much glory to serving in America. But even his speech against America betrays some of his artistic side. One line I love, he says, "There is a charm in the very wanderings and dreams of liberty that disarms an Englishman of his anger." He had some, he could understand, at least on a romantic basis, the cause of liberty. And Burgoyne was very good too at articulating what it was that the British were fighting for. He argued that if Britain lost America, it would lose its empire and it would lose its place in America. And so, in 1775, shortly before the Battle of Bunker Hill, Burgoyne was sent with 2 other generals, and they were sent on a ship called the Cerberus, which is somewhat ironic because that is the name of a mythological 3-headed monster. These 3 generals were sent out without actually many additional troops to help the commander-in-chief in Boston. It was thought that their very names would intimidate the Americans. Burgoyne was actually the oldest of all of them, and I think this is significant. And he would have been the most senior, but for the fact that he had left the army twice. The most senior commander was William Howe, and between him and Howe was Sir Henry Clinton. And these officers were regarded as the best in the British Army because they were chosen over 105 more senior generals. These were 3 of the most junior generals in the British Army. The three of them had all become major generals in 1772, only 3 years earlier, but they were regarded as being particularly well suited to understanding the conditions of warfare in America. Howard served in America during the French and Indian War. He was part of the British's greatest victory of defeating the French at the Battle of Quebec and essentially taking French Canada. He was beside Wolfe when he died. There are some people who think he is part of the famous portrait by Benjamin West of the death of Wolfe. They identify one of the figures as William Howe. Unfortunately, there is no good known likeness, a portrait. It would be wonderful to find one. Sir Henry Clinton was by far the best read man in the British Army, and when they'd come over to America, they'd all essentially been very friendly with each other. But they would all, at some stage or other, command, and they would all fail, despite being remarkably military men. So they arrived in America just before the Battle of Bunker Hill, and this is the famous Trumbull painting. The battle is led by the then senior British commander, a man called Thomas Gage, of which this is a Singleton Copley portrait. William Howe, though, who's by far the most recognized of all of them, really took over the strategy of the battle. Clinton played backup, and Burgoyne complained that he was basically there just as a spectator. He was head of the artillery, but there was very little role for the artillery. Nevertheless, Burgoyne wrote some of the best accounts we have of the Battle of Bunker Hill and why it went wrong. And one of the remarkable aspects of all of these generals is they're very good at critiquing the people above them. Their criticisms have stood the test of time, and yet when they were put in positions of command, they themselves would fail. Burgoyne went back to England after the Battle of Bunker Hill over that winter, and he essentially begged for some more senior command. He actually wanted to go back to America as a civilian and conduct negotiations, which seems to have been a general obsession among commanders rather than fight a war. And then he returned to America as second in command with the governor of Canada, a man called Guy Carleton, and he would have a dummy run of the campaign that we know as the Battle of Saratoga. Guy Carleton did not have a very successful campaign. In early 1776, Burgoyne went back to Britain again, but this time with much more determination. His wife died on his return to England, and that, rather like Cornwallis, whose wife also died when he was back in England, seems to have determined him to go back to America. He produced a plan for waging the war into America from this side of Canada, which became the template for the strategy that led to the Battle of Saratoga. He was very friendly with George III, and George III loved Burgoyne's language, as did the head of the military in Britain, a man called Lord George Germain. He used their language. He talked about the need for bold strokes, quick victories, rather than long, drawn-out campaigns. And I'm just going to briefly show you, and I don't intend to get into a long campaign history, how this campaign is depicted in the textbooks and is widely depicted, is depicted really as an incredible fiasco which different historians blame on different individuals. But essentially the idea is that somebody either forgot to inform someone of what was meant to happen during 1777. One of the three people involved in the decision-making dropped the ball.
British officers worked out a detailed plan for 1777 which they believed would lead them to victory. What did this plan entail? The plan involved 3 separate British armies and perfect timing. Johnny Burgoyne would lead 8,000 troops from Canada, while a separate force under Barry St. Leger would move east from Ontario. The third group, General Howe's main army, would move north from New York City. The 3 British armies would converge at Albany, cut off New England from the other colonies, and destroy the Patriot Army. From the outset, the British plan began to unravel. Howe never committed to the plan, focusing instead on capturing the Patriot capital of Philadelphia, which he did in September of 1777. Rather than moving north to join Burgoyne, Howe camped his army in Philadelphia for the winter. The second British force, under Barry St. Leger, was turned back by Patriot forces under the command of Benedict Arnold. This left Burgoyne's army plodding along through the dense New York forest all alone. He managed to recapture Fort Ticonderoga, but trouble soon followed. Loaded down with 30 extra wagons to support his lavish lifestyle, his army moved at a lagging pace.
So, 3 people are blamed for what went wrong in the lead up to Saratoga. One is Burgoyne himself. He'd drawn this plan that he would march down from Canada. He'd go across Lake Champlain. He'd take Fort Ticonderoga, which his predecessor had failed to do, and then he'd march down to Albany and he'd wait to meet up with William Howe, who would march north from Saratoga. There was certainly never a 3-point plan. Barry St. Leger coming in from the west, he was there to deflect troops and cause a loyalist uprising. It was never suggested that he would meet up with Burgoyne, but there was a vague plan that William Howe would meet up with Burgoyne. But it was a vague plan, and in fact, it was exactly the same plan that the British had had the year before when Guy Carleton, the governor of Canada, had made exactly the same march with Burgoyne as his second in command. And in fact, Carleton got no further than the southern tip of Lake Champlain. The weather started to freeze, and they just turned back. And Howe, in the meantime, made no effort at all to move north. And he would do exactly the same the following year. And the real fact was these armies were expected to act independently and to succeed independently. The general idea was they'd cut off New England along the Hudson, and they would take back different parts of the country, and that at some stage they would meet up. But no one ever suggested what they were going to do when they met up at Albany. It was never really a key to the success of the campaign, because if the sole purpose was to meet up at Albany, it would have been possible for Burgoyne simply to sail to New York and meet up with Howe in the first place. Others blame Lord George Germain, who was the Secretary of State for America. But Germain, in fact, essentially allowed Burgoyne to write his own orders. And Germain had always said that he never believed in giving very definite orders because he understood he was 3,000 miles away and that commanders needed flexibility. But it was easy for people to blame Germain, and many historians have done, because Germain at the time had a cloud hanging over him. This is another Joshua Reynolds of Germain at the time of the Battle of Minden, which was fought in Germany in 1759, in which Germain, for some reason, failed to advance the British cavalry when they could have swept up. Minden was a big victory for Germans and the British, but they could have been an even more spectacular victory if Germain, who was commanding 3,000 troop of cavalry, had advanced. He didn't, and so there were real questions hanging over him, and there was a reason why the military resented him. And then Howe, who was the senior British commander, didn't see any point in waiting in New York all the year just to go up to meet Burgoyne in Albany. Howe instead was determined to take Philadelphia, which was, as far as the British were concerned, the capital of the Revolution. And he did so, leaving Burgoyne by himself. Burgoyne's campaign, as he came back from the Christmas of 1766, incidentally a Christmas in which he'd put a wager at Brooks's with Charles James Fox that he would return victorious by the following Christmas, which was somewhat typical of the rash side of his personality. But Burgoyne's campaign started to come unraveled even from the very start. When he got back to Canada, he found Carleton wasn't that keen to work with him because Carleton had been pushed aside as the commander of the campaign. He'd asked for 11,000 troops and only got 9,000. He was supposed to get many more Canadian militia and Native Americans than he received because he had argued you could make up the lack of British numbers with less conventional troops and less conventional support. He lacked wagons, critically, and he lacked horses. And yet initially he was incredibly successful. Within 1 week, he covered more territory than Carleton had covered in 3 months. And he got down to the bottom of Lake Champlain, and he took what he regarded as the Gibraltar of America, Fort Ticonderoga. In fact, the British occupied this hill opposite, which was thought to be undefensible, but William Phillips, the artillery commander, saw a goat going up the hill and said, where a goat can go, a man can go. Where a man can go, a gun can go. And from there, they managed to repel the American garrison. And at that moment, Burgoyne thought his campaign was pretty well over, that he'd succeeded, and the rest would be a slow victory march down to Albany. The American garrison retreated. He was offered one of the orders of the Garters, and he turned it down because he was so confident that he was now going on to something much greater. And Howe was still waiting in New York to hear about the progress of Burgoyne, and as soon as he knew he'd taken Ticonderoga, Howe left for Philadelphia. Because as far as the British were concerned, the campaign was over. But it was at this point the campaign came unraveled. I won't go into a lot of detail, but the next month was spent going 22 miles further south to get to the entrance to the Hudson River by Fort Edward. Philip Schuyler, his opposing American commander, managed to put logs in the way of every few yards as he moved forward. It was heavily forested. There were no decent roads. He didn't have wagons. The Native Americans managed to be involved in what would later become one of the iconic scenes of the American Revolution, the killing of Jane McCrae. And what is remarkable about this episode is Jane McCrae was not an American patriot. She was actually a loyalist. And the Native Americans in Burgoyne's army had killed her by accident, thinking that she was a patriot. But it was used as very successful propaganda by the patriots, and indeed won Burgoyne condemnation in England as well. As he got a little further, he ran out of provisions. He sent his German troops, who comprised a third of the army. They weren't Hessians, they were largely from the Duke of Brunswick's provinces. He sent them out east to get provisions, and it was just their bad luck that a militiaman by the name of John Stark had 2,000 Vermont and New Hampshire militia, and Frederick Baum, who was the German commander, was essentially surrounded and decimated. In the meantime, he'd sent for reinforcements. Another German commander, Heinrich Bremen, went to his aid, only to find Baum defeated, and then Bremen was defeated as well, and Burgoyne lost 2,000 troops. Burgoyne at that point should have returned to Ticonderoga and should have gone backwards. Instead, he argued, I have positive orders to go on to Albany, and he'd vowed that this army will never retreat. And this was the rash side. The American commander in the meantime had changed to a man called Horatio Gates, and Gates had guessed that Burgoyne would go forward, saying he's an old gamester. And Gates took up a position at Bemis Heights, and what is called the Battle of Saratoga is in fact a series of battles of Saratoga, and all of these places are wrongly named. Bennington, for example, was 10 miles from Bennington, Vermont. It was actually in upstate New York, Walloon-Mac, and similarly with Saratoga, it wasn't in the place of modern Saratoga. The first major battle was in September, early September of 1777, the Battle of Freeman's Farm, and the following battle would be closer and is the one that's often called the Battle of Saratoga, fought in early October. Essentially, Burgoyne walked into what was virtually a trap. His hope was to march past Horatio Gates's army and to go on to Albany. His intelligence was appalling at this point, and one of the reasons his intelligence was appalling is because a lot of his Native American guides had left him. So he didn't even know where Horatio Gates's army was located. This shows the British position. There was a very famous intervention where Gates, his strategy had been simply to wait for the British, whereas Benedict Arnold, who at this time was the great hero of the American army, had argued for an attack of the British position. And indeed, in the late 19th century, a monument was put up to Arnold's leg, which was wounded in this attack, but was indeed key to the victory at Saratoga. The battle, though, did not seem entirely decisive because Clinton in New York started to send troops up the Hudson towards Burgoyne. The trouble was that Clinton largely had loyalists with him and German troops, and only had enough troops really to defend New York, which was regarded as a key, both as a harbor and as the entry into the Hudson. And Clinton never expected to be able to essentially help Burgoyne, other than to create a deflection and to try and persuade Horatio Gates that the British had another strategy up their sleeve. The Battle of Saratoga was a terrible battle. There were a lot of women who accompanied Burgoyne's campaign. One of them was the Baroness de Riedesel, who was the wife of the German commander, and she described this pathetic scene, which was later painted by John Graham at the end of the battle, in which General Simon Fraser was shot and killed, and they had a burial during the battle, and she described how the pastor, there was dust literally going across his face as cannonballs fell all around them. And she herself was remarkable. She had 4 children and a baby that she called America with her and was acting as a nurse. Burgoyne, because of Clinton's feint towards him, was able to basically negotiate a very generous peace terms. It was called the Convention of Saratoga. And Burgoyne was given permission for his army to leave with full military honors and for the army to remain intact and go back to Britain. Congress would never actually fulfill that request. It gave various reasons for not, in fact, carrying out the terms of the surrender. But of course, Burgoyne regarded his surrender as something of a victory and felt that Congress had behaved dishonorably. But certainly at the time, he had, in reality, very few other options. After his defeat at Saratoga, Burgoyne went back to England. His army was taken south and spent a year and a half in Charlottesville, where I live. They were kept in a place which is now called Barracks Road. The senior officers would go up to Monticello. Baroness de Riedesel used to lead the dancing at Monticello with Thomas Jefferson. And it was very important to the Patriots to show these European officers that they could be as civilized as Europeans and have all the same traditions. Burgoyne went back to Britain on a kind of parole, and he immediately teamed up with the leader of the British Army, British opposition, Charles James Fox, to lead the charge against the government. He demanded a court-martial or inquiry to clear his name. He never got it, but in 1779 you had the most incredible scene in Parliament where Burgoyne, William Howe, and Lord George Germain were all in the chamber, all defending themselves and accusing each other of having been responsible for the defeat at Saratoga. What the British government did to punish him was insist that he return to America on his parole and go to Charlottesville with the rest of his troops. He refused to do so, and as a result of his refusal, he was gazetted from the army. He lost all of his commissions, all of his government role. He became something of a figure of caricature. He'd made the error that Cornwallis did not make of alienating George III. Cornwallis very smartly remained a friend of George III and just kept his head down. Burgoyne is only commemorated in one place in England, and this is the house that he owned very near Piccadilly in Hertford Street. It was also the home of Richard Brinsley Sheridan. The two of them wrote a play together after the American Revolution called The Heiress, which became a great hit. Horace Walpole said, Burgoyne will not be remembered for his speeches or his battles, but he will be remembered for the heiress. And in fact, the interior of this house was designed by Robert Adam. It's a private house. This is the very last picture that we know of Burgoyne, very different from the portrait of the confident-looking middle-aged man in the Joshua Reynolds portrait here at the Frick. This shows Burgoyne. It's actually a detail for the painting of the burial scene of Simon Fraser. He became very bitter in his late life. He basically went bankrupt. His wife had died, and he had a mistress, Susan Caulfield, and he had 4 children by her. The oldest was John Fox Burgoyne, who became a very successful British officer who served at the Battle of New Orleans against Andrew Jackson, and of whom there is a statue in London, whereas, of course, it's often mistaken to be a statue of John Burgoyne. John Burgoyne died aged 70 in 1792. He was buried next to his wife at Westminster Abbey, but there was no commemorative plaque. It wasn't for another 30 years that somebody simply put the inscription John Burgoyne. In his will, he essentially had nothing to leave, and he asked for forgiveness for the women with whom he'd had affairs, saying that he hoped he hadn't disturbed any of their peace of mind. Thank you very much. And I don't know if you want to see it, but there is one film in which Burgoyne is depicted, and it was written by George Bernard Shaw, the devil's disciple. And this actually has a very positive depiction of Burgoyne. And Shaw was embarrassed by the play and really never performed it again after it came out. But it was revived, and this is a very short scene with Laurence Olivier, which shows a very serious side of Burgoyne. But later, Burt Lancaster became a huge fan of the play, and so there was a 50s version of the movie made as well. And I just wanted to include this. It's my connection with Burgoyne. I have a painting that came from the Burgoyne family, and it has a twin in a military museum in Norfolk. They're exactly the same painting. This was owned by Sir Albert Richardson, the architect, who bought it in the 1920s from the Burgoyne family of Bedfordshire. He thought it was Sir John Burgoyne, the cousin, but the Military History Museum in Norfolk says that it's Colonel John Money, who was Ralph Earl's patron and took Ralph Earl back to England. No one suggests this is a Ralph Earl, and incidentally, this is their picture, not mine, and it's not, the light isn't very good on it. But besides, every provincial picture looks like a Ralph Earl. So here's this is the scene with Sir Laurence Olivier playing John Burgoyne, if you've got a few minutes.
Before we had made contact with General Howe, with our dragoons on foot, sir, and our artillery not even in sight. Come what may, General, the British soldier will give a good account of himself. And therefore, I suppose, sir, the British officer need not know his business. The British soldier will get him out of all his blunders with a bayonet. In future, sir, I must ask you to be a little less generous with the blood of your men, and a little more generous with your own brain. Swindon, do you at all realize that we have nothing standing between us and destruction but our own bluff and the ignorance of these backwoodsmen? They're men of the same British stock as ourselves. 6 to 1 of us. 6 to 1, sir. And half our troops are Hessians, Brunswickers, German dragoons, and Indians with scalping knives. Suppose the colonists find a leader. What shall we do then? Eh? Our duty, sir, I presume. May I ask, are you writing a melodrama, Major Swindon? No, sir. What a pity. What a pity. Now, come on, make way for the general. Get back there. Go on, back.
So actually, that clip contained an important point that I should have made, that when Burgoyne crossed from Canada, he outnumbered Schuyler by 2 to 1. When he got to Saratoga, he was outnumbered 6 to 1. And the major conclusion of the book is the British never had the support in America. They had an army of conquest, not occupation. They never thought they needed an army of occupation because they thought the majority of Americans would support them. And Burgoyne, to his credit, when he gave evidence in front of Parliament, said, the Americans are not with us. This whole war has been waged on a folly. Furthermore, far from being frightened militiamen, their troops are as good as any that you'll find in Europe. Thank you.